The 1960s in America are known for many things, from the Beatles, to putting a man on the moon, to the Cultural Revolution. But the 60s was also a time when perhaps the most important social issues were front and center, and when major progress was made towards reforms. The 50s and 60s were a time of racial inequality and segregation. The Jim Crow laws in the South were a set of de facto laws under which black or colored Americans were treated as second-class citizens.
Well, I encountered segregation face-on because when I was growing up, we were not allowed to go downtown or to a restaurant. We couldn't sit down at a lunch counter. Even riding the local city bus, it was required by law that black people or African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus. They had two separate water fountains. One was for white, the other one was for colored. Those experiences were very demeaning.
In 1963, George Wallace was inaugurated as the governor of Alabama, a state where racism was especially strong and deep-rooted. Governor Wallace spoke out harshly against the federal government's mandates for integration.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
In reaction to this extreme discrimination, African Americans united and started the Civil Rights Movement. Even though white segregationists were using violence, black civil rights leaders used nonviolent demonstrations and civil disobedience to protest. One of the most memorable demonstrations of this was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28, 1963. Martin Luther King gave voice to his dreams for all African Americans.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
By the 1960s, television was incredibly important to the American public. Close to 90% of families had a TV, and the TV was the center of the household. Television became a political tool because it televised news and key events like the presidential debates. TV journalism became how most of America got their news. If something happened on TV, it affected the entire nation.
The civil rights movement was kind of the first big thing that people saw on television in the late 50s, early 60s, and everyone could see it. It was very easy to see when people were being beaten up because people, the television reporters had cameras and they showed it. And they showed all of these, southern white people beating up all of the black people and beating up all of the protesters. And it was the first time that America saw that kind of violence in their living rooms. And it was very, very upsetting.
During the 60s, Gene Roddeberry, an up-and-coming TV screenwriter, created a TV series, The Lieutenant. It was a show about life in the military. Roddenberry wrote an episode about racism in the military, a tangible and important issue. Even though it was filmed, the TV network refused to air it, or even pay for it, because they were afraid that the public would not respond well. Roddenberry was extremely frustrated by this. It made him realize that in order to tell the important stories he wanted to tell, he would have to both write and produce a TV series himself. Having been a science fiction lover since childhood, Gene set out to create Star Trek. Star Trek aired for 3 seasons between 1966 and 1969. Its stories took place in the 23rd century and were about the adventures of the crew of the Starship Enterprise as they explored the galaxy.
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
While there had been a few other science fiction TV shows, Star Trek was particularly unique because it was the first TV series of any kind to feature a multiracial starring cast. An African-American woman, a Japanese-American, and other actors representing a Russian, a Scot, and even a half-human, half-alien, all playing prominent roles as officers in positions of authority. George Takei played Lieutenant Hikaru Sulu, senior helmsman and third in command. In a time when Asians were barely featured on television, and if so, only in very stereotypical roles as foreigners, Roddenberry's inclusion of Takei as a key member of the crew without an accent was a major breakthrough.
For me, as an individual Asian American actor, it was a personal breakthrough. But for Asians, the image of Asians, it was a tremendous breakthrough.
Nichelle Nichols played Lieutenant Nyota Uhura, communications officer and fourth in command. A singer and dancer, Nichelle aspired to perform on Broadway, but came to Star Trek having acted in a smaller role in Roddenberry's The Lieutenant. When she took on the role of Uhura, Nichols did not realize the impact she would have.
I went in to tell Gene Roddenberry that I was leaving after the first season, and he was very upset about it, and he said, take the weekend and think about what I am trying to achieve here, Nichelle. You are an integral part and very important to it.
Nichelle spoke about how she met Martin Luther King the day after telling Gene she was planning to leave Star Trek.
I think I said something like, Dr. King, I wish I could be out there marching with you. He said, no. No, you don't understand. We don't need you to march. You are marching. You are reflecting what we are fighting for. And I said, well, I told Gene just yesterday that I'm going to leave the show after the first year because I've been offered, and he stopped me and said, you cannot do that. And I was stunned. He said, don't you understand what this man has achieved? For the first time, we are being seen the world over as we should be seen.
This was, in fact, all part of Gene Roddenberry's plan.
I was pleased that in those days, when you couldn't get even blacks on television, that I not only had a black, but a black woman and a black officer. And that'll show them.
Star Trek also conveyed strong pro-civil rights and integration messages through the stories and dialogue in many of its episodes.
Where I come from, size, shape, or color makes no difference. And nobody has the power.
See, you are from the planet Earth. There is no persecution on your planet. How can you understand my fear, my apprehension, my degradation, my suffering?
There was persecution on Earth once. I remember reading about it in my history class.
Yes, but it happened way back in the 20th century. There's no such primitive thinking today.
Star Trek even featured the first ever televised interracial kiss between Lieutenant Uhura and Captain Kirk. Given the tension of the times, the television network was extremely opposed to this scene and attempted to censor it altogether. In fact, this episode was blacked out and not shown throughout the South. Even though the Civil Rights Movement was making progress and had achieved a number of things such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Star Trek still hit a nerve with the TV executives who were worried about how the American audience, especially in the South, would react and how that would affect their ratings. Despite having a dedicated fan base, the show was unfortunately canceled in its third season. The 60s were a time of great change, especially with respect to civil rights, with people fighting passionately for the movement. Many civil rights activists fought in their own way. Gene Roddenberry did so uniquely, via a futuristic story that everyone in America could watch. By exploring the idea that in the future, racial equality and justice were no longer an issue, Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek showed that eventually the civil rights movement would be triumphant. In the decades following Star Trek, there has been substantial progress towards equality across races. In television, African Americans have achieved significant prominence with starring roles or even predominantly African American casts. In fact, some of the most popular TV sitcoms of the 80s and 90s were Family Matters and The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. For other minorities, such as Asian Americans, there is still a huge gap which is only now beginning to be filled. In 2015, a few shows such as Fresh Off the Boat and Quantico, each featuring Asians in leading roles, were introduced to positive fan reaction. This is evidence of increasing diversity and equality in American television. The civil rights movement and the breakthrough efforts of people like Gene Roddenberry in the 1960s had a definitive impact on racial equality and the rights of minorities in America. As a country, we are making progress. But there is still a long way to go before we meet the ideals of Star Trek's 23rd century.